Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Frank Luntz, famed pollster and founder of FIL Inc., is joining us now. Frank, thanks for being back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We have been talking about this entire cycle, how tight margins were likely to be. Turns out they're not quite as tight in most of these battleground states as they were in 2020. And I just wonder your takeaway here when it comes to whether or not the polls were adequately reflecting the reality in America. Once again, doesn't it seem like polls underestimated Donald Trump?
To a small degree, yes. And that is about turnout. That every Trump supporter became a Trump voter, but that is not the case with Kamala Harris. And that's one of the reasons why she fell short. Certainly the idea that Trump would get a majority of the popular vote is a surprise to a lot of people right now. And is the Iowa poll, which I want to draw attention to because that changed the actual narrative of the campaign for the last 48 hours. Trump ended up winning Iowa by about a dozen points or so. The poll had Harris up by 3. It was not only beyond the margin of error, it actually changed how the race was being covered, which is really one of the rare times when survey research actually becomes part of the narrative. I think that there's a lesson for Americans in the future, which is to spend a lot less time talking about who's winning and losing and a lot more time talking about what the candidates say they're going to do and why either we should believe them or distrust them.
Sounds like people were wrong about a lot, Frank. They were wrong about the protesters showing up at the DNC. They were wrong about violence around polls, wrong about poll watchers, wrong about, in some cases, even though our polls were tied, the idea that there was momentum behind Kamala Harris as well. I'm wondering if there's a reckoning here for pollsters. Was there an overcorrection in the sample, and what's going through your mind today?
What's going through my mind, because I've been asked this in almost every show, is this is the media. The pollsters did get it wrong, but the media went all over this Iowa survey, went all over trying to see some trends, some movement in one direction or another, and that they're the ones who drove this. I tend not to talk about polling when I do shows like this. I talk about policy. I talk about language, what the public wants to see and hear, and whether the politicians are doing it or not. And so much of this is actually driven by those who ask the questions rather than people like me who answer them. Because we wouldn't answer them if we weren't asked them. I don't want to make a blanket statement because I take this so seriously. And I so approve of the way your show handles politics. It's one of the best shows in all of television for politics. But I do think that there needs to be a reckoning for what we choose to focus on and how we cover it, because in the end, it becomes misleading or even detrimental to the political process, as that Iowa survey clearly was.
Well, Frank, we appreciate the kind words. And of course, there always is room for critique when we consider how the narrative is shaped in America, and media plays a role in that as well. I think we can all agree. Earlier on in this cycle, there was a few conversations that happened in quick succession, one being whether or not the media was putting too much focus on the age issue for Joe Biden, then became whether or not the media was complicit in covering up how deep those issues may have run for the current president. And I just wonder, as we consider the role of Joe Biden in all of this, his late withdrawal from his re-election campaign, if ultimately you think that made a difference, if the timing mattered, or if it was never going to be possible for an incumbent administration, given the kind of inflation experienced during it, to keep hold of the White House.
I don't believe that. I challenge the narrative which has been put forward now for weeks. Vice President Harris had one of the sharpest, fastest rises of any candidate in modern history. She went from 5 points down when she got into the race to 3.5 points up in a matter of a few weeks because she was joyful. She talked about the things she wanted to do instead of the negativity, which he decried again and again. She was hopeful and optimistic and talked about all the things that she wanted to get done. But then after the convention, she turned dark. She turned negative. It sounded as much like a Trump campaign as it did a Harris campaign. And that was when she hit her ceiling. And then and by changing this, by being joyful and then being harshly negative, calling Trump a fascist, voters started to wonder, who is she? Is she authentic? Is she genuine? How do you go from being joyful to damning your opponents? And then Biden, of course, made the comment about Trump's voters, and it didn't ring true. That's number one. And number two is she never articulated exactly what she wanted to do in the first hour, in the first day, first week, first month, first 100 days, and so on. If she had done that in the CNN town hall, where it's done live, if she had done that in the 60 Minutes interview or the Fox interview, any of these, if she had done that and told voters exactly what she wanted to do, she would have done much better, because then it would have been about policy, and that's where she was weakest. But instead, she got driven around. She never answered the questions that voters had, and so she never crossed that threshold. Whereas Donald Trump, we knew him. There was nothing more we could learn about him. We knew his weaknesses, we knew his strengths, we knew his record because we saw it for 4 years. So her criticizing him didn't add anything to her, did not detract from him, and I think that that's one of the reasons why she lost.
The diagnosis from Frank Luntz on Bloomberg TV and radio, all of that said, Frank, what did we learn about our nation last night, particularly if this in fact was about men versus women?
I love that question. And that's a question that we need to be talking about over the coming weeks and months, because there are some things that are more important than an election. It's the next generation. And what are they learning? They're learning that it's okay to tear your opponent apart. They're learning that there is no bounds to negativity, that there are right and wrong ways. But they need to learn that there are right and wrong ways to approach politics, to approach economics, to approach day-to-day life. And I'm just afraid that what we now learned is the wrong thing, which is anything goes at any time for any reason. And that frightens me for the future.
Well, okay, so if we keep looking at demographics here and what the future may hold, Frank, I look at Donald Trump's victory in Miami-Dade last night. We haven't seen a Republican win that county for decades. It obviously is majority Hispanic. We did see a sizable break among Latinos for Donald Trump in a way we haven't seen in the past. Obviously, movement for black voters as well. And I wonder if you think those demographic shifts are unique to this candidate who is now president-elect, or if that may be something more permanent.
It's unique to this candidate, but also to this time. That it doesn't matter whether you're white, black, brown, it doesn't matter. If you have trouble affording food, to put food on your table, to put gas in your car, or the health care you need and the housing that you want, then it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. What matters is you're struggling. You're living paycheck to paycheck. And that's what's happening right now. And Donald Trump articulated an empathy to that much more explicitly than Harris did. She tried to run away from it. Now, Trump's greatest weakness is he didn't focus enough on prices, on costs, on affordability. That instead he got sidetracked by issues that did not matter. And in fact, I want to acknowledge something. I'm going to go back to that presidential debate that clearly she did relatively well and he did relatively poorly. In the end, it did not matter. I thought the debate performance would cost him his candidacy.
Wow.
And instead, it actually did not matter. And that's another learning that America has to face, that even when you put two candidates side by side, the outcome does not necessarily matter in who wins for president.
Really great to have you back, Frank. Frank Luntz, founder, CEO, FIL, and just the voice we were looking to hear today. Thanks for being with us throughout this entire campaign.